Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Sam Huneke about his new book, I Will Not Abandon You. Oh, there it is. Perfect. Your cover looks better than mine. Mine's on a digital tablet. So Sam is a professor. He's an award-winning author, and he's a professor at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. This book is nonfiction. And will you give the audience an overview of what I Will Not Abandon You is about?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me on. So I Will Not Abandon You is about the experiences of queer women in Nazi Germany. And so, it's sort of, whenever I tell people about this, oftentimes the first reaction I get is, wow, that's such a niche topic. And in some ways it is. In some sense, though, it's really about queer life under fascism. And more broadly than that, it's about life under fascism. It's about what the Nazi regime was, how it stayed in power, and how people survived and existed under Nazi rule. And the reason I was really interested in talking about queer women specifically, I was interested in talking about queer people. I am a gay man. I am a historian of gender and sexuality. My first book was about queer people, in particular gay men, in post-war Germany. And so I'm broadly interested in how, the histories of queer people. And the reason I was really interested in queer women, specifically in this period, is that there was a law that banned male homosexuality under the Nazis. And that history is pretty well known. We know that there was the Pink Triangle, that many gay men, around 10,000 gay men, were sent to the concentration camps where they wore that pink triangle. We know that there were about 50,000 men who were prosecuted under the sodomy law, convicted under the sodomy law in the Nazi period. But we know a lot less, or we used to know a lot less about queer women. And in particular, the reason for this is that there wasn't a law. And so even though the Nazi regime was very much hostile to trans, queer, nonconforming people of all stripes, they didn't always have a specific law that said, okay, if this woman is denounced to the police as a lesbian, here's what should happen to her. And so it's this much more amorphous kind of persecution. It's a much more amorphous relationship between this persecuting state, the Nazi state, and queer women. And I was really interested in digging down and understanding how people like that exist, how they survive, what kind of suffering they're subjected to in this violent persecuting society, even if there isn't a specific policy or law. That one of the reasons this really intrigues me is I think we see so many parallels to other modern societies, our own society as well, where you have minoritized groups, you have oppressed groups that suffer persecution, that aren't given the full range of life opportunities, even though there aren't specific laws that say we are discriminating against this specific group. And I think understanding those mechanisms of persecution is both intellectually gratifying, it's interesting, it helps us better understand fascism and the Nazi Germany, but it also helps us better understand our own time and place.
One of the things I was impressed about was at the beginning of the book, you talk about how, because of Article 175 was specifically about gay men, the gay women were not, or lesbians were not targeted. But that's not the case. And I thought to myself, well, why don't we know this? But the fact is, it's something that I've come to terms with, generational trauma. When you've been persecuted or prosecuted and persecuted, you tend not to write it down because, you suffer in silence often.
Yeah.
And so let's talk a little bit about the silencing part.
Yeah. Yeah. So exactly, as you say, there's this law, paragraph 175, article 175 of the Penal Code. That's the law that criminalizes sex between men. And that is a really well-known law. It's eventually fully repealed only in 1994. And one of the legislators who is involved in that repeal describes it as the most famous law in German history. So this is a well-known thing. In contrast, there isn't a specific law for lesbians. And so when they come to the attention of the police, it is a whole grab bag of different kind of tools that the police have to try and deal with these people. So in some cases, they are dragged in for interrogations. In some cases, they're cataloged as being homosexuals. In some cases, they're prosecuted for, say, causing a public disturbance. In other cases, they are sent to the concentration camps, and they're typically labeled as so-called asocials, which is this grab bag category of persecution that tons of different people fall into. And so, first of all, you have this very nebulous kind of persecution. We know, thanks to my research, thanks to the research of many other feminist and queer historians, that queer women were persecuted as queer women, right? Someone is denounced as a lesbian and they wind up in a prison, in a concentration camp because they are a lesbian. That said, because there isn't this one category under which they're persecuted, that makes it hard to trace in the archives. So when I was going to the archives, it was truly looking for needles in haystacks. There are tons of these archives around Germany. I would go to them either in person or write to the archivists and say, listen, I'm writing on this topic. Can you help me out? Do you know of any files that deal with this topic? And sometimes archivists would write back and say, well, everyone knows lesbians weren't persecuted, so no, we don't have anything. And I would think, okay, well, that isn't very helpful, nor is it accurate, but thank you for your time. In other cases, an archive would write back and say, yes, we know of one single document, one single file. And in other cases, they would write back and say, yes, we have dozens of files. And so it really was this painstaking work of archival recovery. So that's sort of the first reason that there's silence, is that it's hard to just find these archival files. The other reason is, as you say, there's trauma. Many of these people after the war didn't want to talk about their experiences. And that has to do with the fact that male homosexuality, is still illegal after the war. Many male concentration camp prisoners who are initially let out by the Allies are arrested again and put back in prison on the theory that they haven't served out their time of their sentence. And queerness in general is still stigmatized in East and West Germany for many decades. For queer women, if you are married and have kids and then want a divorce to, explore your sexuality, whatever, oftentimes East German courts would consider that in deciding who to award custody of the children to. So there's this huge amount of stigma. People don't want to talk about it. It also isn't a recognized category for reparations. So if you want to apply for restitution under one of the laws that gets passed after the war, being persecuted on the basis of your sexuality isn't a valid reason for getting that restitution, for getting recognition of your suffering. And then on top of that, the one last thing that I really want to kind of mention, because I would be remiss, is that when people start writing this history, start writing queer histories of the Holocaust and of the Nazi period, they tend to be gay male activist historians. And unfortunately, we know, I wrote about this in my first book, many of these male activists tend to be misogynistic. They tend to be very dismissive of the lesbians in the movement. They tend to be very dismissive of lesbian history. And so the same thing happens there, where they say, no, gay men were persecuted, lesbians weren't. I think part of it is an internal misogyny. I think part of it is a concern about diluting the claims that they're making and saying, well, we have a law. We know that there were gay men in the concentration camps. We don't want to dilute that by, exploring all these other ways that people were persecuted. And so really, it's thanks to the painstaking work of these early lesbian feminist historians who they start conducting oral histories. They start this work of going through the archives and looking for these cases. And decades later, I was able to build on their work and the work of many of my other colleagues who research queer Holocaust history and put out this book.
Well, and not to put down any one group of people, because I don't want to be labeled as misogynist, but I worked with a woman whose parents were Holocaust survivors.
Mm.
And I remember when I first met her, there was a push here in Los Angeles to have more inclusion of LGBTQ plus people in the Holocaust conversation. And Joyce was very against that because she felt like it watered down her parents' experience.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized is she didn't dislike LGBTQ plus people. She just had a limited understanding because of the way she was raised by two parents who had survived the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I used to wonder sometimes, because I was not educated in how generational trauma works, is why is it she's so caught up in this every day of her life? But she lived with it every day of
Mm-hmm.
her life because her parents had lived with it. And I
Yeah.
think it's that part of history that we can't ignore someone because they're different. I'm not Jewish and I'm not black and I'm not a lesbian, but I can't ignore my brothers and sisters who might fit into one of those categories just because I don't have their lived experience.
Absolutely. And on that topic, I want to mention two other things. So first of all, one of the other real difficulties with writing this history, right, is when we talk about the Holocaust, when we talk about these monstrous events, we're so tempted to put people into strict categories. One person's a victim,
Yep.
one person's a perpetrator, one person's a bystander. And one of the things I really wanted to explore in this book is how that just isn't always true. People don't fit into these nice, neat categories. And one other way that this isn't true is that many Holocaust survivors, people who, experienced horrible things, who survived, one of the greatest atrocities in human history, um, they oftentimes would perpetuate certain stereotypes in the oral histories and the way that they remembered these events. And one of them is that many of these oral histories that exist contain elements of homophobia in them. And that made it very difficult for queer Holocaust survivors to talk about their experiences. Um, Oftentimes, interviewers would also, sort of exhibit a degree of homophobia and wouldn't want to talk about those issues. I'll mention this isn't a big issue in my book, but my colleague Anna Haikova, who also writes on this, has written a lot on this topic. But in the camps themselves, these are homosocial environments. These are, men and women are separated in the camps. And that leads to a lot of homoerotic friendships, relationships, also a lot of sexual assault in the camps. Really difficult things to talk about that crop up in oftentimes uncomfortable ways in the oral histories, in people's memories after the event. And so that's another element to this and another reason why it's taken so long to really have a full reckoning for the experiences of queer and trans people in Nazi Germany.
So I believe, I could be wrong about this, so I'm going to ask you, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any reparations for LGBTQ plus people?
So a little. It's been very slow going. In 2017, I believe, the German parliament finally passed a law that it expunged all paragraph 175 convictions, including those after the war. So the ones from the Nazi period had already been expunged in an earlier law. This one followed up with all of the post-war ones. And it said anyone who had been convicted under it was eligible to apply for reparations. Now, I don't in front of me have the statistics on how many people successfully applied for those reparations. The problem is by 2017, most of the people who had been convicted under the law, especially in the Nazi period, were dead.
Right.
And so I don't know. It would have been a very small number of people who actually were able to do this. Lesbian victims, there aren't any specific laws, again, because there isn't a specific piece of legislation under which they are persecuted. And that actually links up with this issue of, I already mentioned the so-called asocials. These are people who just for whatever reason didn't quite fit into Nazi society. And so it's this big nebulous grab bag category. It sweeps up not only queer people, but also homeless people, the so-called work shy, Roma and Sinti, Afro-Germans, and more, sex workers. Really, anyone who just doesn't quite fit in could be labeled asocial and sent to the camps. And this is a huge category. There's, I want to say about 80% of all camp prisoners by early 1938 are asocial. So this is before the start of the Holocaust proper, before the November pogrom of 1938, when massive numbers of Jews start being sent to the camps. So before that, the asocial is the largest category. And only in, I believe, 2020 did the German parliament actually acknowledge that this was a category of persecution, that these were a category of victim. And so, because that's the category under which queer women were sent to the camps, when they were sent to the camps, it's been even slower going for these other queer groups and these other so-called forgotten victim groups.
So I don't remember the character's name, unfortunately, but there was one story that you tell in your book about two women who were together, and one of them's mother turned her in because she felt that her mother, or the mother felt that her daughter was being corrupted. And what starts out as "Can you bring my daughter home?" goes terribly wrong. And that is one of those things that that's something I've just never understood. How can you do that to your child or family member or loved one?
No,
And you
exactly.
know what the consequences are going to potentially be, but for whatever reason, you think that you know better.
It's true. So, I mean, there's several of these cases in the book where parents, family members turn in their, their child, their loved one, and I think it's just so disturbing to us to think of a mother turning in her daughter for being lesbian. And in this book and in some of the other stuff I've written on this topic, I have tried to explore that and think, okay, what actually is the motivation here? And I think, first of all, you have to get yourself in the head of a person who thinks that homosexuality is one of the worst things, right? This is someone who maybe believes it for religious reasons, for other reasons. This is also someone who's been subjected at this point to about a decade of Nazi propaganda that paints queer people as not just sort of socially or morally degenerate, but literally as enemies of the state. That is how Nazi propaganda painted queer people. And so you have to get yourself in the mind of someone who believes this very earnestly and has been subjected to this propaganda. And then on top of that, one of the real fears around queerness and homosexuality in the Nazi period was what they called seduction, the seduction of youth. And what they meant with that is very similar to what conservatives or far-right people today mean by grooming. Namely, that homosexuality is not congenital, it's not inborn, you aren't born that way in their view, but rather they are made that way through seduction, that an older queer person will kind of latch on to a teenager and seduce them and turn them homosexual. And that's what the Nazis believed. And that was what their propaganda espoused. And so in many of these cases, it tends to be a younger woman, 18, 19, 20, 21, and she is allegedly having an affair with an older woman. And this arouses these fears of seduction, both in the police, who eventually review the case, and in the parent, who is the one who brings the case to the police. And so I think you can kind of start understanding that these cases aren't always about punishing the daughter, but rather the parent is trying to rectify what they see as their daughter going down an incorrect or dangerous path. And I'll just sort of say one other thing, which is, in the US, if you had, or in any other modern country, if you had a child who was behaving in a way that you felt was wrong, perhaps criminal, you didn't know what to do with them, you might turn to social services for help. And essentially, that is what is oftentimes going on here. But, it winds up being the police that they're going to for help with their kid. And because it's Nazi Germany, because it's this persecuting state, that all of a sudden comes with all of these other potentially really awful consequences.
And I think it's important also to point out, because this is not only Nazi Germany, this happens in a lot of countries around the
Oh,
world,
yeah.
even today. And I see so many parallels between the US and Germany, especially after World War II. We had heroes that came back who liberated the world, so to speak, from fascism, but they come back and then they're just dumped into society. And some of the same things that were going on in Nazi Germany began to infiltrate here. We have the Lavender Scare, we have the Red Scare, we have
Hmm.
all this kind of hatred towards other people that we see festering all around the world. And I think until we learn to accept each other as human beings and not as the enemy, we stand to repeat this again
Hmm.
at some point. Hopefully, not this catastrophically, but at the same time, what we don't remember, we often repeat.
No, it's true. And I mean, the sort of depressing lesson, I think, from this book and from a lot of my work is that no matter how accepted sexual minorities are, or really any minority, the tide can always change very rapidly. Weimar Germany, the 1920s, Germany's first experiment with democracy, was this remarkable moment for queer people. You have, male homosexuality is still technically illegal, but you have this vibrant subculture that consists of bars and clubs, particularly in places like Berlin and Hamburg. You have political organizations, you have activists, you have periodicals, and not just for gay men, for lesbians and for trans people as well in this period. And it's this remarkable moment of opportunity that once the Nazis come into power in 1933, that door slams shut faster than you can imagine.
Yeah, and so keeping this on a happy note, Sam, right?
Yes.
So I was really disturbed by one thing that I read towards the end of your book about the number of women who were violated by either
Mm.
Russian or
Hmm.
Allied troops after the war. We left a country in shambles, but we also let unlawful or lawless people run free
Hmm.
in Germany and raping and pillaging. And the misogyny that goes on in this world is unfortunately it still exists.
Oh, yeah.
And it is something that, Lord, I really wish there was some way we could purge the world of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is another piece of this, right? When you are writing about gay men, I mean, I guess I'll step back and say, when I first started my career and was writing about queer history, I really wanted to kind of weave together gay, lesbian, trans history all into one. And one thing I really kept coming up against is that the experiences oftentimes of gay men are, defined by their sexuality and but also by the fact that they have a certain degree of privilege and visibility as men in sort of 20th century Western societies. And similarly, that lesbian women, their persecution is oftentimes defined first and foremost by their status as women and only secondarily by their status as queer people. And so that's sort of why I wound up writing a book about gay men and a book about lesbian women. And I think when we get to the post-war, sort of the end of the war, the post-war period, the thing that defines women's experiences in these years is the ever-present prospect of sexual assault by occupying troops. And this is most prevalent with Soviet troops, where we know about 2 million German women were raped by Soviet troops. And that essentially, although this was officially not allowed by the Soviet commanders, it was sort of tacitly encouraged that they turned a blind eye to it. And I actually had a student who wrote a really wonderful term paper years ago about how Soviet propaganda, kind of encouraged this kind of behavior towards German civilians as retribution for the atrocities that German
Sure.
troops had committed against Soviet civilians. But you also have plenty of sexual harassment, sexual assault by Western troops in Germany as well. It gets to be enough of a problem that the occupying troops, the Allied troops, or the Allied governors of the occupied country, they suspend Germany's abortion law, the law that outlaws abortion, so that all of these women who were raped and are carrying the children of their rapists can go and get abortions. I mean, it's just horrifying.
That is. So the book again is called I Will Not Abandon You. I will say that while it is not a happy subject, it is a necessary subject, Sam, and I really appreciate you writing this book and bringing it out into the
Thank
world.
you.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.